Hello, and welcome back to The Hated and the Dead with Tom Lehman. A bit of housekeeping first. I have started to upload short clips from the podcast on YouTube, in the hope that this will attract new listeners to the podcast and make it easier to share the episodes on social media. I've left a link to the YouTube channel in the description to this episode, and will do so for other episodes in the future. Today's episode is the second in the rather less horrible series, where I take a step back from the nastier side of politics and examine a less disliked figure. Of course, disliked doesn't mean harmless or meek, and by no measure was today's subject either of those. Michael Foot was, without a doubt, one of the most intelligent British politicians of the 20th century. A brilliant orator, he led the campaign for nuclear disarmament during the 1960s. He was a committed socialist and was a stalwart member of Labour's left wing from the 1950s onwards. Foot is best remembered for his brief leadership of the party from 1980 until 1983, when he resigned after overseeing Labour's worst general election result since the war, a title claimed since by Jeremy Corbyn in 2019. This, as well as both Foot and Corbyn's relative old age by the time of their ascension to the Labour leadership, have led to cheap comparisons between the two men. These, in my view, are misleading. Whilst Corbyn cut his teeth defying the Labour whip decade after decade, Michael Foot served in the Labour governments of the 1970s and was always closer to the party's leadership than Corbyn ever was or still is under Keir Starmer. Foot, as a notable newspaper editor and literary critic, also claimed achievements outside of politics that Corbyn cannot. To the extent that Corbyn can be compared to anyone in the story of the 1980s, it is not Foot, but Tony Benn, a man my guest has more than a thing or two to say about in today's conversation. That guest is the man who succeeded Michael Foot as Labour leader. He is, of course, Neil Kinnock, leader of the party from 1983 until 1992. Neil is the first person to have been both the subject of one of my episodes and the guest on another. And unless I end up securing an interview with President Lukashenko anytime soon, it's likely to stay that way. Neil's insights into his friend Michael Foot's career are fascinating, and his speaking style is amusing, engaging, and, I say totally affectionately, coming from a Welsh family myself, very, very Welsh. Ladies and gentlemen, it's time to introduce Michael Foot. Good afternoon, Neil. How are you?
I'm fine, thanks. I hope you're well too.
Yeah, all very good on my end, thank you. Neil, when did you first meet Michael Foot, and what were your immediate impressions of him?
I first met him, I'd heard him many times, but I first actually met him in 1965 when a good friend of mine, our local county councillor, he invited myself and Glenys, who was my girlfriend then, to come for a Sunday morning walk on the hills above Tredegar, my hometown, with Michael Foot. And of course, we were thrilled. I think overwhelmed would be the most accurate term. And when we met him, we were astounded by his normality. And of course, I learned later he was always terrific with young people. We were in university at the time, and this was completely natural for him. He was inquisitive, he was interested, he was candid in what he had to say, and we had a wonderful Sunday morning, followed up by a pint in one of the local clubs, because we'd only just ended Sunday opening in the pubs in South Wales then, or just ended Sunday closing. So we went to one of the clubs and had a pint together as well. So that was a terrific, 3 hours, I guess.
I think to sum him up, he wasn't a long-lasting leader of the Labour Party. He wasn't an electorally successful leader of the party either, but he was without doubt one of the cleverest leaders that the party had, and
Yes.
one of its greatest orators. Just to give a bit of background, he was born in 1913, the year before the outbreak of World War One. He was born into quite a political family based in Plymouth in Devon. He was privately educated. His father Isaac had been a Liberal MP. This was quite a privileged start in life, Neil, for somebody who would become a radical Labour politician, Labour, of course, being the party of the working classes. His was not a working class upbringing. How and why do you think he became a socialist?
Until he went to Oxford University, he was an active member of the Liberal Party, following in the tradition of his family, particularly his father, Isaac Foote, whom he loved and revered, and indeed the rest of his family, one of whom later became a Labour Attorney General, Dingle, his brother. Another became an eminent historian and was a Liberal peer. And Hugh Caledon, Hugh Foote, his brother, became a field marshal and the governor of Cyprus. The whole family were strongly engaged in politics, including his mother, indeed. And he never had any doubts about his liberal values and his liberal political support until he went to Oxford University, started to encounter socialists and converted, and I think that's the proper word so far as Michael was concerned, to socialism. But what made him a socialist advocate, and a very ferocious one, was his experience after he returned from a debating tour with the Oxford University colleagues and with the English-speaking Union of the USA. He got a job as a shipping clerk, a very unlikely profession for somebody with a PPE from Oxford, in Liverpool. And in the early 1930s, he witnessed such devastating universal poverty that he saw the need for the application of his socialist convictions, and typically of Michael Foote, was never less than 150% engaged. So he became an advocate with street corner meetings and scribbling out leaflets and so on, which was also quite a family tradition, because they'd never been coy liberals. They were always on the radical side of the party. And he found that transition, together with his abilities as a public speaker and a polemical writer, to be very easy indeed. But it's from his time in Liverpool that Michael thought of himself as a radical socialist and espoused that cause with full energy.
I mean, you used the word radical. I think that's one of the words which is most often used in relation to his socialism. He was a socialist to his core. He was first elected to Parliament in 1945 in the Labour landslide of the post-war election. He actually lost his seat in Plymouth in the 50s, but then he became the MP for Ebbw Vale in Wales in 1960, which I think is probably a better, or was a better fit for his politics, as I think Ebbw Vale was probably more of a hotbed of socialism than Devon was.
Yeah, I participated in his selection as the Labour candidate in Ebbw Vale. My home seat, Tredegar, the town that I came from, was part of the Ebbw Vale constituency. And when our MP, Erin Bevan, died in the summer of 1960, I was in the sixth form. I was also a very active young socialist and was a delegate to the General Management Committee, the selection conference that selected Michael. We encountered problems because although Michael was very comfortably shortlisted for selection, he was then vetoed by the National Executive Committee of the Labour Party and struck off the list. And the alternative favourite, a dear friend of mine, a great comrade, Ron Evans, who was a councillor in Ebbw Vale at the time, was on that list and pretty certain to become selected as the candidate. Ron was one of those who sent a written protest to the National Executive Committee against the exclusion of Michael Foot, and Michael was eventually duly replaced on the shortlist and indeed won the selection conference on the first ballot. Ron Evans then became his lifetime agent, and a very effective political operator Ron was. But that was the maelstrom in which Michael became selected for the constituency of Ebbw Vale and was then elected in the early November of 1960.
I suppose it's quite a fitting start to his political career, which was so often, when he was so often kind of ensnared in the internal politics of the party. If we just go into the 1960s a bit then, Labour became the party of government again in 1964 under Harold Wilson as Prime Minister. They governed Britain for 6 years, but Foot didn't always have an entirely harmonious relationship with Wilson's government. He actually turned down a place in the government.
Yes.
And Foot basically became the standard bearer of the left within the 1960s. How did Wilson and Foot's conceptions of Labour, socialism and governing socialism differ?
I think it really revolved around Michael's conception of the use of democratic power. He believed in the mandate and thought it should be used, and this is a favorite word of his, an energizing word, in audacity in government. In that respect, it was one of the things he inherited, both, I think, from his father and his family, but also from Aneurin Bevan, of whom, of course, Michael had been, certainly up until the dispute over unilateral disarmament in the late 50s, Michael had been a great stalwart, outspoken supporter of Nye Bevan. And if you think of Harold Wilson as a pragmatist before making a final commitment and getting on with the task, then you'd have to think of Michael as an audacious socialist who didn't believe in charging blindly at anything, but did believe that democratic power should be used assertively and imaginatively. And I guess that was the divergence between them, although Michael always had high regard for Wilson as an individual and as a skillful politician. He nevertheless believed that power should be used in, I'll use the word, in a more assertive, even dramatic way than Wilson was prepared to do. Of course, that also is subject to some conditions or reservations. For instance, when Wilson became Prime Minister in 1964, he had a majority of 3. And that obviously constrained the actions of that first Labour government in 13 years. Michael, therefore, was prepared to be very patient about one of the central commitments of the manifesto of 1964, and that was the renationalisation of the British steel industry, which was a matter of vital importance because grossly underinvested, the steel industry was in perpetual danger. And of course, apart from Michael's general interest in that. There was the crucial reality that the biggest employer by far in the Ebbw constituency was the Ebbw Steelworks. But Michael was willing to counsel patience and caution in the period of that first Labour government. And then, of course, when the 66 election came in March 1966, and Harold Wilson had a majority of getting on for 100, then the argument for patience dwindled, and they got on with the task of securing the renationalization of the British steel industry. So in the circumstances when patience was required, Michael was a serious, restraining character, counseling the exercise of reasonable patience with a government with a tiny majority. After that, of course, he became very assertive in his demands for the public ownership. But there were other areas in which he thought that Wilson was too cautious, or indeed veered in the direction of convention. Just give you two instances of that. Michael wanted Harold Wilson to actively denounce the American policy of war in Vietnam. Wilson was much more cautious, but kept us out of the war, and Michael always gave him credit for that. And then when Barbara Castle brought forward her white paper, In Place of Strife, which proposed new measures to make it more difficult, I think that's the best way to describe it, to call strikes, then Michael, with a close association with the trade union movement, but also real antagonism to what he thought was an incursion on basic civil rights, and played his part in bringing about the defeat of Barbara's proposals, even though he, throughout his adult life, had a close association with and deep friendship with Barbara Castle.
I suppose that a lot of his later opposition or say friction within the 60s came from the fact that Labour had, as you said, a much larger majority after 66. They actually lose the election in 1970 after what some saw as quite an underwhelming term from 66 to 70. This is a really interesting point because Wilson, a kind of moderate social democrat, realises he had to come to some sort of compromise with the left of his own party. And as part of this compromise, Foot actually came into government when Labour took back power from the Conservatives in 1974. One of the tropes of British politics in the 70s, Neil, in the media, among the chattering classes, was that there was an incipient far-left takeover happening within Labour, and that this would eventually bleed through to government and to the country. In reality, though, do you think Labour did move to the left much in the 1970s? I mean, if the sort of outlook of the Wilson-Callaghan government of the 70s was still basically capitalist in orientation, it accepted austerity measures from the IMF. It did not cave into the demands of the trade unions that often, if you look back at the account. Do you think that perception of a left-wing hostile takeover of the country was exaggerated?
There are several assertions within your questions there that could be very misleading. I didn't take a note of them, but I'll try to deal with them for context. Not in any defensive spirit, but for context. First of all, Harold Wilson owed his election as leader of the Labour Party to the fact that he was considered to be a product of what was called the Bevanite Democratic Socialist Left. He resigned from the Attlee government in 1951 at the same time as the Aneurin Bevan and a couple of other ministers in protest at the way in which the budget was being allocated to rearmament, which required the imposition of National Health Service prescription charges. And throughout his whole period before becoming leader, Harold Wilson was associated with what I suppose in later times would have been called the sensible left. So he and Michael Foot were part of certainly a major tributary of the great broad Labour stream. Secondly, the election in 1974, which produced a minority Labour government, the February 28th election, and then in October 74, a tiny majority, meant that obviously there were constraints on the government. And what must never be forgotten is that during the period of that government, through no fault of that government, there were two massive world oil price hikes, which were nearly ruinous for many economies. And of course, the United Kingdom economy, as a major economy, manufacturing economy, even then, was really badly hit by the cost consequences of those oil price hikes. Despite that, the Wilson-Callaghan government introduced many major changes, for instance, effectively revolutionizing health and safety at work, saving many lives, both in immediate accidents, but also in industrial diseases. They transformed the social benefit system so that it was more demanding and more just. And they made many other changes, including the rescue of the British shipbuilding industry, which was in dire straits.
Sure.
And they at least postponed its end for several years. So you can think of them at a distance as being modest, even fragile social democrats, but actually they used the power that they had, which was limited by economic and political circumstances, in the most judicious and effective way. And of course,
sure.
in that...
I don't disagree with anything you just said. What the point I was trying to make is that by the 1970s, a flank had opened up to the left of Wilson and Callaghan, which was dissatisfied with the cautiousness of some of that government's...
To come therefore straight to the point, because I allowed myself to be distracted by the various assertions in your question, in the wake of Labour governments, there is always a tendency. The same thing happens to a degree with the Tories, but markedly with the Labour Party. There is a tendency to denounce the immediate past, to accuse that government of being too cautious, middle of the road, even right-wing, and to react against that with a declaratory radicalism that warms the cockles of activists in the Labour movement, but fails to impress the electorate at all. And that happened in 51 and throughout the 50s. It then proceeded to happen in the early 1970s. And by the mid-70s, there was a leading figure, very charismatic figure, a talented figure who could articulate all that, Tony Benn. Now, Tony had been a cabinet minister in both of the Wilson and Callaghan government, and had, in 1970, I wouldn't say discovered socialism, but by his own account, had become a radical and impatient socialist. And as can happen to people in their late 40s and early 50s, when they discover a cause, they become demanding in pursuit of that cause. And it meant that the ultra left had a figurehead that had a following and could offer, without any kind of bill of accounts, the most imaginative and far-reaching series of demands without ever having to demonstrate their usefulness or workability. And that was Tony Benn. In my view, and of course, during that period, I found myself diverting from Benn because of what I perceived to be his superficiality and grandstanding. I increasingly thought of him not as the admirable figure that I'd seen in the 1960s, but as a rather self-indulgent and simplistic politician who was going to endanger the prospects for democratic socialism by exaggeration, playing into the hands of Labour's enemies, who always, of course, through the last century and more, have sought to give the impression that the most extreme demands made by the most radical are actually the mainstream of party policy and in danger of being implemented with ruinous results.
So you mentioned that often when Labour loses power, the party tends to have these internal machinations where it ends up denouncing its recent past. This very much happens. I mean, this might be the best example of it all, of course, is 1979, when Margaret Thatcher's Tories come into power, and James Callaghan, who had been the relatively moderate Labour leader, resigned, and this left an immense opportunity for the left to sort of take power within the party. As you said, the left had a new flag bearer, Tony Benn, by this stage. But in the leadership election that takes place in 1980, it's kind of neither the right or sort of the moderate wing nor the very hard left of Tony Benn that takes power. It's actually Michael Foot. But bizarrely, by this stage, he is kind of a consensus candidate between the two. Is that right?
Jim resigned as leader of the Labour Party about 18 months after being defeated in the 79 election. He'd wanted to go before that, but he was fearful of the turmoil that by then existed in the Labour Party and stayed on until literally he could bear it no longer. He resigned, and several people thought that Michael Foot would be the obvious choice as a figure of the left who could unify the party. I was very much against him running, and so indeed was he. We talked about it, of course, to some thorough depths, and when I was able to give him my calculations, together with those of a very close friend who was on the other side of the party, Philip Whitehead, the late Philip Whitehead, I showed him our joint calculations, which demonstrated that on a very, very good day, he would lose by 9 by Philip's account, 11 by my account, the electorate then, of course, being only Labour MPs. There was no electoral college then. And Michael looked at the figures and said, "Oh, that's good news. Let's go and have a drink." So he was quite pleased that he had some statistical political basis for the view that he took, that he shouldn't stand and wouldn't stand. He felt that he was too old. He thought it was time for a new generation. But on a Saturday afternoon, a week or so after Jim had announced his resignation, Michael returned from Dublin. He'd been giving a lecture in the cathedral on Dean Swift, Jonathan Swift. Of course, Michael had written a book about him and was a living expert on Jonathan Swift. He returned from Dublin to find waiting for him in his house several trade union leaders and Ian McArdle MP. And over the hours, they talked him into running, quote, quote, as a duty to the Labour Party. And it was that sense of duty that made Michael willing to run. He called me, told me his decision, and I said, well, you know what my view is. I suspect it's still your view, but since you're running, I'll help you campaign. So together with Stan Orme and John Silkin, I managed Michael's campaign. And in the end, to our astonishment and his, though actually by the day of the final result, we weren't astonished. He actually won by 10 votes over Dennis Healy. And that's how he became the leader of the Labour Party. Reluctantly, but of course, again, typically, the moment he was elected, he plunged himself into the role wholeheartedly. And I knew that he was volunteering for a long, painful march to hell because of the state of the Labour Party. And I didn't trust some of the figures who'd pledged their undying support for him, because I knew that the moment there was difficulty, they would be departing and rowing their own canoe, which is exactly what happened.
Which is what happened,
of course,
yeah.
Amongst those figures was Tony Benn. He wasn't alone in that, but he was certainly a leading source of difficulty for Michael's leadership.
There were obviously other figures within the Labour Party that rowed their own boat as well during this period, perhaps in an opposite direction. The so-called Gang of Four, as four more moderate Labour members of Parliament who had been in the cabinet, the Callaghan cabinet.
You shouldn't inflict the difficulty on yourself by using this word moderate quite so generally, because as the Gang of Four and the, I think, 27 Labour MPs who deserted to the Social Democratic Party demonstrated, moderation was not really in their playbook.
Okay, let's use the word Social Democrat instead then, because that was the name of the party that they formed, the Social Democratic Party.
Social Democrats, but I'm not sure what that means. I mean, at the time, I said the offer that they were making was Labour with the bomb and without the unions, and that was basically it. Their great promotion was on the basis of what they weren't rather than what they were. And although they included in their ranks people I admired, like Shirley Williams, for instance, who was a most reluctant member of the Gang of Four, they owed everything they had to the Labour Party, and they showed their lack of leadership qualities and their lack of political conviction by running away at the promise of a real struggle against the ultra-left. They didn't stay to sustain the Labour Party in the way that Michael Foot and Dennis Healy and Roy Hattersley and Gerald Kaufman and others did. They ran away from it and tried to profit from its funeral. That failed, of course, but I wouldn't call them moderate. I certainly wouldn't call them that.
Well, this sets up a disastrous election for the Labour Party, because the old Labour vote has now been split between two parties. The Thatcher government, which had been incredibly unpopular, gets this massive boost of popularity due to the Falklands War, which Mrs. Thatcher used in a very pugnacious populist way. And by 1983, the stage is set for an awful election for Labour. What are your memories of the 1983 campaign? And as the election was going on, do you remember what Michael Foot thought of it? I mean, was he kind of headstrong,
Yes.
and he believed that he would prevail, or was he fairly honest about the situation?
I'll happily come to that, and
Sure.
in detail if you want. But can we take a step back? Because it's got to be understood, Michael became leader in November 1980. He then was confronted 2 months later in January 1981 by the defection of the so-called Gang of Four. In the April of 1981, Tony Benn declared that he would run against Dennis Healey for the deputy leadership of the Labour Party. And that meant that between April of 81 and October of 81, there was effectively civil war in the Labour Party, stirred up, of course, by this utterly unnecessary and unjustified decision of Benn to run against Healey. Now, as the background to that, when Benn declared his candidacy for the deputy leadership, he never had the guts to run against Michael. We were 10 points in the lead in the polls, and in the early May had very good local election results. By the time in July of the by-election, nearly won by the SDP, the new SDP in Lancashire, we were behind the SDP in the polls. That transformation came as a result of the turmoil in the Labour Party. And then, of course, in 82, there were two developments. One you referred to, the Falklands War, another cause of division in the Labour Party, because Michael, absolutely rightly, in my view, made, first of all, the very, very best speech challenging the Argentine junta and their action of invading the Falklands at the first day of that conflict. And he put Thatcher and everything she stood for in the shade. He'd been fighting fascists all his life, and that showed. So when that occurred, however, the ultra-left thought that the policy of declaring war against fascist invaders should not be followed, and that brought division as well. So what I'm describing is Michael having to try and navigate his way through a turmoil that was in part made difficult by defections from the Labour Party, but much more grossly made difficult by the fact that inside the Labour Party, led by Tony Benn, there was a substantial faction intent upon opposing Michael's leadership and the mainstream of Labour Party views and opinions. And the other thing that happened in 1982 was the beginnings of economic recovery from the recession inflicted upon the UK economy by the policies of Margaret Thatcher and Geoffrey Howe from their election in 1979. That was the background to the 1983 general election.
Sure.
All of that, you asked me about Michael's view. All
Please,
of that was recognized, of course, by Michael, but he didn't have a capacity for despair. So here we are in 1983.
Of the campaign itself, the sort of, let's say, 8 weeks running up to when Mrs. Thatcher dissolves the government to when the election is held, was it obvious at the time that Labour was headed for this awful result, or did it come as something of a surprise when the results came in?
Well, I wasn't alone in believing that we would be very, very badly beaten. I couldn't guess a figure to put on it, but I knew it was going to be a very, very heavy defeat. My only hope in that was that we would at least secure a larger share of the popular vote than the Social Democrat Liberal Alliance, because it was crucially important that if we couldn't win first past the post system, when you've got three viable parties, it's going to be very, very difficult for two of those parties to secure the votes that give them the seats that enable them to form a government. So it was clear to me that the strength, which had been reduced but was still substantial, of the Social Democrat Liberal Alliance was such as to deny us the possibility of victory and would add to the probability of heavy defeat. That's how it turned out. So far as the Labour campaign was concerned, I was so appalled by it that I developed my own campaign, my own schedule, my own organization, and simply went around the country. I did 92 public meetings in about 3.5 weeks.
What appalled you?
I lost my voice as a result.
What appalled you specifically about the campaign?
A total lack of any semblance of modern political organization. There was no coordination of activities, of speeches or anything else. None of that was Michael's fault. Of course, he was leader of the party and he tried to strengthen the organization of the party in the years beforehand. But it was under a leadership of people who were extremely decent and very loyal to Michael, but had no concept of the need for effective political organization, mobilization, coordination. And these sound very managerial words, but in any battle, political or military, they're words that really have to be applied effectively in order to make a difference. And they didn't exist so far as the Labour organisation was concerned.
Labour only got 209 seats, I think. It was their worst seat share in post-war history until the last defeat under Jeremy Corbyn in 2019. Just to bring this to a close, Neil, the picture you've painted of Michael Foot isn't somebody that was open to self-pity. But the way that you've described the 83 election, the fact that he wasn't quite in control of his ascendancy to the Labour leadership and the period after, did you ever feel slightly sorry for him on that campaign?
Well, yes, of course I did. Part of it was the empathy of a beloved friend. He was, in many, many ways, intellectually, politically, morally, courageously, a giant of a man who took on serious challenges out of duty, not because of his judgment. His judgment was against doing it, but he took on the challenge of being Labour leader in 1980 simply out of a sense of obligation. And as I said earlier, I had the most massive, indeed unsurmountable reservations about that, because he was my friend and comrade, and I didn't want him ruined by what I knew would be the terrible travails of his leadership, given the state and mentality of some of the more influential people in the Labour Party at the time. It's one of the reasons why, when I got the opportunity, I regarded them without mercy, because they hadn't only seriously damaged, almost irretrievably damaged the Labour Party, but they'd inflicted ignominy on my comrade, and that I don't forgive. And so consequently, here was this man, the author of, I don't know, a dozen or so highly regarded works, an editor of a major national newspaper at the age of 28, an incomparable polemicist and reviewer, as a writer, someone regarded even by his political enemies with affection, and certainly by just about everybody with undying respect. And here was he, flat on his back, with just 209 seats to show for his pains in 1983. So I felt, sorrow and solidarity, and I always enjoyed his company and could never find the huge room for compassion that he had in dealing with those who were mainly responsible for the size of his defeat.
I'm glad to say that he lived a very long life. He only died in 2010. He was 97, I think, when he died.
Yes.
I've seen videos of him cheering on Plymouth Argyle, which was his football club. It did look, at least to an outsider, that he had a pleasant retirement.
Well, he did in many ways. I mean, when Jill, his wife, died, that was a terrible setback. But with massively supportive friends, he got through that. And obviously his love for Argyle was always undiminished. I'll tell you a story about him. The one season that Argyle spent in the old First Division was 1939. And he and his brothers went to White Hart Lane on Boxing Day to see them play Tottenham Hotspur. And of course, there was some drink taken. And Michael, at some stage in the first half, in his delight at a Plymouth goal, invaded the pitch and was escorted out by the police. But such was his mastery of the spoken word, he talked them into letting him back in after halftime and resumed his place in the stands. Now, that's a story I've known about him for decades. And I was always able to threaten him with the release of that story. But I never did it. And it's only in the wake of his death that I retold that story. An absolutely marvelous story. Someone who later became a field marshal, someone who later became an attorney general, and someone who became leader of the Labour Party and a cabinet minister, Lord President of the Council, no less, Michael Foot, getting into trouble at White Hart Lane.
Brilliant. Neil, that's been a brilliant assessment of a remarkable man, and thank you so much for your insights on him, because your affection for not just your colleague but your friend have been, really, really vivid and obvious there. I just have one more question. This isn't related to Michael Foot, but you gave a speech in the 1980s where you said you were the first Kinnock to go to university in 1,000 generations. I'm sure you remember it. And it caused, in 1988, a younger US Senator called Joe Biden plagiarized that speech.
He's only 6 months younger, for God's sake.
No, not younger than you, just younger than he is now, is what I meant.
Sure.
I didn't mean that. And it caused, when he plagiarized your speech, it caused such a scandal that he had to suspend his first campaign for US president. You might never have become Prime Minister, Neil, but how does it feel to have done what Donald Trump never could, which was to stop Joe Biden in his tracks?
Well, there are a lot of tales attached to that, but one I do like is an analysis I won't give the source, that says if Joe hadn't, on one occasion, and it was the only occasion, plagiarized the speech without acknowledgement, because on all other occasions, he always said what the source was, not that his audiences had the vaguest idea who Neil Kinnock was, but nevertheless, the attribution was there. And so he was safeguarded. If he hadn't done that, then he would have probably indeed, become the Democratic nominee in 1987 for the 1988 election. He would have been beaten, there's no question about that at all, by the former head of the CIA, George Bush. And that would have meant that he was consigned to being a senator, maybe for the rest of his life. But instead of that, he recovered, went back to the Senate, became very highly respected, was chosen to balance Barack Obama's ticket, became vice president, and then, in facing Donald Trump, was selected as the Democrat candidate and then happily elected. So, this analysis concludes, it's not my analysis, I do insist. If it hadn't been for the fact that Joe stole your speech, he wouldn't be president of the USA today.
Excellent. Have you ever met him to tell him that?
Yeah. I haven't told him that one. But we saw each other quite a few times in the late 80s. And then I saw him again. Last time I actually saw him face to face was in 2007, when he was in his senatorial office. He was the first person to tell me that he thought Barack Obama would be the candidate and the president. He was certain of that. And this is before there was even a hint that he would become Barack Obama's running mate. So in the meetings that we'd had, we exchanged political ideas, obviously, but he brought me up to date on his various triumphs and tragedies, and by God, he's had a lot of the latter, which has made him pretty steely in many ways.
Yeah.
And I could tell him about what was going on in the European Union and UK, and yeah, it was a nice relationship. He's a very decent, normal fella with his feet on the ground. I like him.
It seems that way. Neil, it's been a brilliant conversation. Thank you very much.
More than welcome. Bye.
Bye. Thank you for listening to The Hated and the Dead. If you've enjoyed this podcast, follow it on Spotify or Apple Podcasts to get updates whenever new episodes are released. If you're just on that last stretch of your commute to or from work, or have a spare 2 minutes, please leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. It's the best way to help the podcast grow.